Luc Jacobs studied Ballet and Gaga. He is an independent choreographer. Luc danced with the Royal Ballet of Flanders in Belgium, Deutsche Opera Berlin, and many more. In 2002, Luc joined Batsheva Dance Company. Since 2005 to 2020, Luc has been the rehearsal director of the Batsheva Dance Company. He has choreographed for the Batsheva dancers through the years.
How are you in these?
I'm good, thank you. I haven't been working for a while, I guess, like most people. So I've been stuck at home for 6-7 weeks or something. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But I think work will resume again in a few weeks. We'll go back to the studio and we'll take it from there. Nobody knows what will happen yet.
Of course. I think it's really going to change a lot now. How, as people who are moving physically, how are we going to start rehearsing again or just dance together again? No? Do you have any fear of that? Do you have any? Are you trying to think of what it might be like, or are you just wanting to go with the flow?
No, I'm thinking. Well, I've been thinking a lot about how this affected, not just everyone, but also the dance community, and if the epidemic will recur, if there will be pop-ups again, if it will influence, the way governments regulate our lives in terms of traveling and social gatherings, and so it affects very much performing arts. So I'm curious if dance has to think of other ways to deliver its message. Smaller theaters, smaller viewings, more online things. I think it might shape the way we think and present movement now.
Absolutely. So I just want to ask a very basic question first. Why do we feel the need to move, and not just as dancers, but any ordinary human being, and moving in every way, like moving from one place to another, just moving our body, or just wanting to dance, or just the way the entire universe is moving? Why is that for you?
Do you call that a simple question? I'm always worried when people say, I have a simple question. It's actually, at least to me, a gigantic question, because it's not very... I think most people, when they hear the question, they will agree in a sense at some level, but to explain why is much more difficult. But I think there's something innate in movement that has to do with life itself, and that expresses itself, like you just said, we moving, but also traveling to other destinations. There's a life has to do a lot with motion at the physical level and emotion at the psychological level, that there's a sense of always going to the next destination. There's a natural sense of, whether that's, it's at the physical level, but also at the mental level. We're always trying to get to the next point, the next idea, trying to get the next thing, to the next project. We're kind of living from highlights to highlights. And movement is something, I won't even mention that it's very obvious for very basic physical health that the body needs to move, but it also wants to move. and there are so many ways we can move, you know, from dance to sports, from you know, yoga to Chinese qigong to but I think there's something very beautiful about movement, because it's something the mind cannot land on, so it can dissolve in it. It's a place where we can get freedom from ourselves in a way, by dissolving into the activity of movement, in particularly when it's dancing, because you could say it's more celebratory than a normal activity of moving, like doing the dishes. Although I think in theory it's possible, one could lose oneself in that, but dancing, and especially when it's the situation where there's a viewer and a performance, it kind of heightens the situation. It makes it even more, it kind of enables us to commit more to that moment because somebody is viewing. Not that we need to therefore perform, but just the situation itself intensifies lots of elements. You know, our adrenaline, our attention, our, you know, things get a little bit more vivid in a situation like that. I doubt that I really answered your question, but and I want to think about, ask me again in a.
Okay, because it's again, it's not a question in a way that there's an equation to it, you know, and that you must. I'm interested to know this from your perspective, you know.
Right. Yeah.
That's exactly what you did. So, what is it to explore being human through movement or through dance, or the kind of work that you do, or the kind of work that you've been doing for a while now with the Batsheva Dance Company, or just for yourself also? What is it to explore being human? What is it to be human in the first place?
Yeah. I think movement is in a sense even prior to being human, in a sense that nature, creatures, there's some, but in a human being it's very particular as far as I can and for me, well, it has been such a long journey with movement, and just to, you know, when I started studying dance and movement, it was very, very different to how I think about it now. You know, it had more to do with achievement, or getting this thing, or getting it right, getting it perfect, you know, according to the criteria that had been imposed on me. Then at some point in that career, you know, I met situations and people that reminded me that that before we even move, we can appreciate our body. Before we move, we can listen what a glorious experience it is to have a body. You know, that enables us to think, to see, to smell. You know, that enjoys the whole array of experience. You know, from the most sometimes painful to the most how do you say, exalting, or religious experience, what you will. So So just to take a step down or take a step back rather, and to just to sense a body is already magnificent, because the body, to me at least, is at a whole different level than thought. Thought usually takes snapshots and interprets, what the body experiences. But if one, and we don't have often a chance to do that, but if you could experience the body as it is, without memory, or which is thought and imagination and all the conditioning and the impositions we have posed upon it, such as we need to look bigger, we need to look more white, I wish my eyes were bigger, I wish I was stronger so I could win the race. We have enslaved the body, in a sense, to our egomaniacal projects, in a sense, saying it a bit strongly. But even at the subtle level, the body is always used as a slave to enable our, we just want to get ahead. So, but if you could leave that aside for a moment, just to consider the body without its history and memory, it's an amazing thing. And it informs us about things, about our experience, that thoughts cannot tell us. In the body you can feel the boundlessness of sensation. It's total chaos, but at the same time it's also a total wonder and miracle. I mean, I cannot just explain it to you in 5 seconds, it took me 50 years to be able to say it. So, but I mean, we could speak more about it, but I'm not sure if that's what you...
No, I would love to speak more about it.
Yes.
Yes, please do.
Well, I've been running a lot of meditation sessions lately for, because the epidemic has provided things, time and opportunities. So one of the first things people ask is, in a meditation session, is to close their eyes and just to put aside, as I suggested a bit before, to put aside, or in the background at least, any thinking about the body, because a thought about the body is obviously not an experience of the body, it's an experience of the mind. It's, if you look at a tree, there's the word tree, and there's the actual experience of seeing. And similarly, an image is also not a direct experience of the body. That would be like having a map of something, of a map of Rome, and actually going to Rome. So also that is not... So to go to the experience of the body, we need to temporarily, at least, kind of subside thought and image. And then if you go to the sensation, and if you, let's say, you go to the edge of the body, which we normally call skin, you don't really find an edge. You can't really tell. There's no sensation that's distinct to the body that stops where you see a border called skin, and then where another sensation starts, which is called space or air. So the sensation itself does not give us any information about where body starts or space begins. If you look for a center, you wouldn't be able to find it. And if you look for a fringe, you wouldn't be able to find it. You wouldn't even be able to find a perspective from which you see that sensation. So things get very confusing from the point of view of conventional thinking. Because conventional thinking says, through science and and there's nothing wrong with that, obviously. We have skin, and science took everything apart and gave names to everything it could see and looked at everything in terms of processes. But all these are explanations and have nothing to do. That would be like explaining the taste of ice cream rather than eating an ice cream. There's a huge difference. They're both different ways of looking at experience. One is more descriptive or explanatory, and it has to do with the age we live in. We live in an age that's very materialistic, scientific. Everything's made out of matter and objects, and we're looking for the smallest things and the biggest things. So that's the model of thinking where we were born in, and it's always very difficult to step out of a model you were born in unless you have the chance to leave, or some situation allows you to look beyond it. Or but if you have, like in my work, I have a lot of time and opportunity to deal with the body, and to explore, and then yes, and I feel it's in the body that you can find presence, groundedness, the stability. Because there's a real sense of being that is kind of nested in the body, and that being is kind of it's boundless. It's and everybody can experience it, and we always experience it when we fall in love. For instance, when we fall in love, especially in the beginning, there's this period where this tightness we usually feel, that it just opens up, and it's not really that you become bigger, but it's that the usual border that exists between you and somebody else dissolves, and there's a sense of unification. Yeah, and at that moment, that you feel the body as it is, which is just a sensation of you could call it love. It sounds a little bit fluffy, and I usually don't say it, but
would you say the body is forgiving?
the body doesn't even need to forgive. At the level of the body, things are already forgiven. Nothing is. Could you say a little bit more, because that could be very easy to.
Yeah. So I'm thinking that a lot of times I think we, and again, I don't speak just as someone who, people who are aware of their bodies, who are able to move, who are able to explore beyond what our normal daily life movement is, because I think a lot of us are also very restricted in terms of our language, our movement language, our knowledge of movement. And I feel that sometimes repressed emotions, for example, you shouted at me and I felt something and I couldn't tell you how I felt. And so I kept that inside me, and it'll just stay in the body, unless I somehow manage to release that. Or so there's one that in that way, and then there's another way to perhaps, think, to have this notion that, okay, if I keep going and going and going with my body, which is a great feeling for me, um, um, I apologize if I'm being very abstract, but like we're saying, it's not black and white, right? So if I keep going and going and going, and I hurt my body, and then I wait for it to feel better, but then I keep going and going and going in the same way, not changing the way I should do something, or the way I should, you know what I mean? So
I
in
know
that
exactly
way,
what you mean.
yeah. So in terms of emotions, in terms of all these things, the body knows. The body knows what we're feeling, what we're thinking, right? And it just stays. I mean, I feel that. I mean, for many years, I had a lot of anger about some things, and I could sense my body just having that in it, you know. Even if people would tell me, so in Pakistan we have a very small dance community, and no matter, I mean, if you just stick to that, you know, people would appreciate you anyway. And people would always tell me like, oh, you're so free spirited, and but I knew inside me that I wasn't very free inside of me, you know, except that I was all right, bolder than the rest of the Pakistanis with my body. I was moving, I was doing all of that. But a lot was happening inside me, which is hard. You know, in that way, you think the body is forgiving.
Yes, I'm with you. And those things you mentioned are so important for people to hear, I think. So to address the first thing, yes, trauma is stored in the body. And also, not just that, whenever we have, in most cases, for most of us, when we have a thought, it colors the body. If I get angry, my breathing changes, tension appears, everything changes, you know. If I'm feeling relaxed, I'm on the beach, I'm having, you know, so the body is always colored with what goes on the mind. So, and that can go anyway, you know. If you experience something painful in your life, you might not even recognize it at that moment, but the body at some point it will remember, and it can be triggered again. So one of the things with movement, and especially movement where you really start to listen to the body, not just telling it what to do, but to really listen as you move it or don't move it. Usually for most people it's easier to listen when they're not moving, although it doesn't make a difference, I would say, ultimately. But then those those little traumas can resurface, they can be triggered, and you don't know how they will transform. Sometimes moving can bring about a tremendous amount of release, or, you know, pleasure, ecstasy, you know, because if something's locked for a long time, and you start to listen, and movement starts to penetrate in that area, and that held area of tension, I call it tension, it's a little bit of a negative term, it's just something in, you know, but when that's released, that can bring about it can also be very painful or very emotional, you know. I mean, you hear sometimes of people doing dance classes and they come out very emotional, or especially if you're not used to moving the body. And also, like the other example was perfect. Sometimes our body's so enslaved with what our mind wants to achieve that it will keep pushing at no cost. And the body, you know, the body can heal very well. It's usually us who are standing in the way. At the same time, there's something very interesting, not that I would recommend or anything, but, you know, for example, there's ultra runners who push their bodies beyond any reasonable limit, you know, and they just keep running for these long distances. You need to recover for 2 months afterwards, but, you know, they just illustrate the example you just gave, that they just keep pushing and pushing and pushing and pushing. And the stories or things I heard about it, or speaking to people, it's that they come to a place actually of just running, whereas until they get to that place, you know, they have to go through tremendous willpower, pain, emotional upheavals, you know, and they use anything available to them in their psyche to keep on running. and then in the end it's all of kind of used up and they're just running. And I sometimes think of this amazing example. One of these ultra runners said, how did it go? If you want to improve your health, start running. If you want to change your life, do a marathon. And if you want to speak to God, do an ultra marathon, which is anything longer than 40 kilometers.
Nice. So, we spoke a little bit about human elements, and I mean, what is it to be human, and how one explores with that. But in your work, for example, you also go beyond what's being human.
Yes.
And how do you do that? Why do you do that? What do you do with it? And how does it help you to, not help, but how does it, I don't know, enrich your experience of movement, or maybe enrich your understanding of what you do?
Well, where I work, we don't speak about it in those terms. So, but I think, like we kind of hinted at before, the body is a psychosomatic experience. So that means that anything is possible. So through refining your imagination, you kind of can refine the expressions and the articulation of the body. And yeah, it's a human thing, but to me, experientially, it has nothing to do with being human or gender, or, you know, in my as we kind of hinted up before, the body really has no shape, only when you imagine a shape, because sensing itself, it's pure sensitivity, and that can be infused with imagination. So when you dance, and again, we are privileged here, you can explore the whole range of imagination and sensitivity that both live apart and at the same time become inseparable at the level of dancing. The level of dancing, there's a total union between imagination and sensation. And so that's a lot of fun, because you can pretend to be anything without taking any risks. You can manifest as, anything. It can be human, but you can explore any concept. Can be hijacked by dance and used in some kind of creative way. So to dance is a lot of fun, because it's one of the most privileged professions, because you can get to explore, more than any art, the senses at so many levels, at the level of imagination and thinking, at the level of touch, the level of seeing, it's a very it's a very varied experience with many ingredients. Of course, if you play a flute, it's your whole body is involved, and your total sense of being and attention is involved. It's also unified. But there's not that requirement to move, so it's more, dancing takes it a step further, because it really starts riding on imagination rather than playing a flute. It's much more.
So these ingredients that you speak about in your classical career, when you were just you were really focusing on classical ballet, and that was what you were doing. Um, was the search of all these ingredients, beyond the body and beyond all these things, was that still there? Were you still constantly looking for something more? Or did you manage to do that later at some point? Because
Yeah.
Hmm.
No, that wasn't there. When I was a young child, I was swept up by, this very strict classical ballet. I knew what I needed to get done and and it was. So I was very busy with that initially. I wasn't thinking about what a body is or what it feels like. I just needed to get that pirouette nailed down. But then as I became a professional dancer, I always felt like it was like a feeling I didn't belong. I felt always like it was a little bit silly what I had to do. I mean, I didn't mind the physical aspect, but I started to feel a sense of unfulfillment somewhere. Like my fulfillment was coming from getting a thing done, or getting that role, or being able to succeed my pirouette. But when I wouldn't succeed, it wouldn't give me satisfaction. When I wouldn't get that role, I would be upset. Or sometimes you do get a role, but it's not the role you want, or you have to do it in a way I didn't want to do. Often in classical ballet, there's such a convention of behaving. If you take a step back and look at it, it's totally ridiculous sometimes. So very, very gradually, there was a sense of unfulfillment, which I compensated by. I got myself totally lost in studying Chinese medicine and practicing Chinese Qigong and martial arts. And there I found an element that I felt was missing in my work, in my ballet career, an element that had to do with listening, with healing, with softness. It was also a very different model of thinking about experience. In Eastern medicine, things are more seen in terms of their processes, their interactions, rather than solid things. So all that and a lot of philosophy and Eastern thinking that came from both India, Japan, Tibet, I started to feel drawn to that until at some point I started to take up a practice of meditation. That was like my mid-late 20s. It was just, I read a book. I remember the incident very clearly. I was in Waterstones looking for books because I'd been doing a lot of martial arts, and sometimes meditation was required in my training. And I started to notice that in meditation, my mind felt in a way that it didn't feel in other situations. I started to experience things that really, really intrigued me. So I wanted to know more about meditation in particular. And I saw a yellow book called The Myth of Freedom, and the title struck me because up until then I had assumed that freedom isn't a myth, it's a goal that we all should, ultimately strive for. So I took this book home and it just blew my mind. And it was like it was written for me. So I wanted to know more about this teacher and this tradition. And so from that point onwards, I could say that I started to become more serious. And then I became more engaged over the years. Now I can't remember what led me to tell this entire story.
Because I asked you about how you started to explore, and were you able to do it when you were
Right.
in your classical
Yes.
yes.
So yeah, I wasn't really knowing, exploring it, but there was a sense of unfulfillment. And you know, it's not, I'm not claiming that I'm fulfilled now. I
Yeah.
think as a human, to experience yourself as a human is to live in a state of always seeking and unfulfillment. But I don't think that should be regarded as a problem necessarily.
Absolutely.
But
I want to quickly share something as well. I also came from an Indian classical dance background. And even though, you know, with the book that's called the Natya Shastra, where it's an entire book of all the Indian classical dance forms, where we have words and we have the names and of what a particular position is called, and also it's a complete art form. You know, we're taught how to act, we're taught how to speak, how to sing. All these things come with it. So on one hand, I mean, as you speak about ballet, on one hand, there's this feeling of fulfillment and feeling that, oh, we can be more human there. But another thing that I went through, which I don't think happens often in your culture, is the guru thing, the guru student thing. You know, so there's this constant feeling of you must stay just with the guru. And but we're human beings, we're also wanting to be free in that sense. We want to explore more, right? And I often felt that okay, the dance, also with the dance, you're not really allowed to explore more with it. It's like mathematics. This is how it is. You must do that, which is great. It teaches you discipline. But at one point, I felt the same, and I felt that there was more to movement. There was more that I wanted to explore. And again, it's like a language. It's like you speak a language, you know the words, you know the vocabulary, you get better at it. But then how else do you don't just express yourself through a language. You express yourself through other means of expressions as well, right?
yes, all the time.
Yeah.
I probably even more so than in language. Yeah, the guru student thing, that's fascinating. It's true, I'm from a Western culture, but I had a bit of a glimpse of it because I, you know, was involved in Tibetan Buddhism for a long time. And at some point, that guru student relationship becomes extremely important. So, but of course, it's in a very different context than classical Indian dancing.
Yeah, I think it also depends on how it happens and what happens with it. But if it's a beautiful relationship, I think it really means the world then. But coming back to um, body and dance, where so I read somewhere that you said Gaga is is interesting, but it's also not something new. It's something that already exists in all the dance forms and in our body.
Is that something you read?
Yeah. Yeah.
Did I write that or somebody else?
No, you spoke that, but someone else wrote it on your behalf.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I thought that was very interesting because it's true. It exists. It's just that because also when I took a lot of Gaga classes through N.O.D, Silvana Ronaldo's program in Torino, that's where I met you. Also for me, it taught me a lot in many different ways, even though I've never, I never knew about it. And how have you explored further than what Gaga gave you?
Yes. It becomes trickier and trickier because it's getting very much organized now. But what Gaga points out, and to me, in a way, I probably said it's nothing new because it's things we can find in our own experience, how to
Exactly.
use gravity, sensitivity, you know, like we spoke before, the body is already sensitivity itself. Gaga speaks about passion. You know, we all feel passionate all the time. It's something that's very, you know, whether it's to go to the fridge and get another, or the cupboard, or go, you know, that we're always. So Gaga speaks about things that are common to all of us, you know, that stand outside of borders and nationalities and religions and all that. It's using elements that are common to all of us. Of course, Ohad is an individual like anybody else, so the way that investigation will express itself in a particular way, but it doesn't need to, you know. I mean, of course, there's many people now that copy the way he moves, but those qualities have nothing to do so much with form rather than with the engagement of the body and the listening to the body. So it's a mix of skills and listening, you know, and it can range, you know, you can, now things are getting very much structured, but you could take that range anyway as a teacher, you know, according to its user or the situation.
How did your exploration of your own movement change beyond all the things that you had been doing, going into Buddhism, going into or learning or being introduced to Gaga? Because of course you are an individual yourself, and what was your exploration? What came out of that? What were your discoveries about to express yourself, you know, taking all the different elements and knowledge that you had created around for yourself or you had learned from, even if it wasn't something physical, you know, even meditation.
Oh, I see. Okay. Well, that was a very long and varied process. When I first encountered Gaga, it blew my mind. And I felt that was what I was looking for. And then when I came to Israel, you know, and doing Gaga, I also started to realize, not initially, but that I had a lot of misconceptions.
Conceptions, yes.
Conceptions, thank you.
Fine.
So that took me another few years for these misconceptions to slowly fall apart. And I remember being confused at the very beginning. I came from a classical background and I came to Batsheva, and people weren't really pointing their knees or their feet, for instance. And I remember thinking whether that was a choice or that was sloppiness, but all I could see was the form. I couldn't yet see, you know, that maybe they were just filling the space with their arm or reaching out with their foot in the space. And so it didn't matter whether that finger was straight or that finger is, you know, it was something totally different. And I knew I liked what I saw, but I couldn't tell what was behind, you know. I couldn't. So that took me a while to so there was a process of just kind of trying to understand what was going on, how it was related to choreography, how, you know, how they interacted. And I think only when I stopped dancing, I started to learn more, because I could start to see more. And also spending time with Ohad, you know, you start to, because he comments, so you start to tie things together. And so I was a really, really good Gaga student for a very long time. And then through actually running into kind of Indian philosophy and Advaita and, You know, I run into some teachers that come from, you know, the great gurus from India.
Mm-hmm.
And I met one of those Western teachers who, you know, who represents that tradition. And in one of those meditations, something happened and I couldn't go back. And it had to do with sensing. You know, he asked in a guided meditation, you know, he guided us slowly to experiencing the body. And he said, all you know of the body is sensing. That's how you know the body, through experience, right?
Mm.
So gravity is a sensation. And then he said, how much does that sensation weigh? And it just something like a coin dropped. You know, how we impose. He wasn't implying that gravity doesn't exist, but it's like, how much does a sensation weigh? And obviously a sensation has nothing to do with weight, you know? But at the same time, it's the most direct way through which we know gravity, and that sensation itself has no weight. And then that conventional picture I always had in my mind of the body, it just dawned upon me that even though I was a dancer and had been doing it for 30 years, I was just what I wasn't sensing. I was picturing my body, you know, as I was moving, I was imagining, but at the level of sensing, you know, the whole level of the whole experience of sensing is kind of floating itself in a space, a knowing space, but there's no actual experience of a body falling down into the ground, even though, of course, scientifically and conventionally it's an agreed upon, you know, I'm not denying that, but I'm talking about the actual experience of things is so different from when we speak about it. And at that point I started to get confused in Gaga, because Gaga sometimes mixes up instructions with descriptions and explanations, and sometimes it says things, and that confusion helped me in a way, because you know, in Gaga is sometimes you might say something, you know, feel the distance of things, and we immediately react and behave in a particular way, and it's a totally valid instruction. But if you take the instruction literally and you look for a feeling of distance, there is no such thing. You can, you know, you can imagine distance if your eyes are open. If your eyes are closed, you have to, but you know, I can't even tell sensing whether my head is 2 centimeters or 5 meters wide. There's no way of knowing how big a sensation is. So when an instruction is said to me, feel the distance of things, or feel traveling movement, or feel texture traveling through your body, totally valid as an instruction, and it will immediately trigger something and it will activate. But I'm talking, if you take that literally and start to investigate that, it doesn't make sense at all. You know? And it was only because, you know, I'm kind of this hard-headed, complicated person, probably. But I really started to take these instructions literally for many years, while at the same time knowing what they meant, of course. You know, they're just triggers to make people behave and move in a particular way or to. And so by taking them very literally, I started to discover things I hadn't seen before, you know, about weight, about movement, about texture, about sensation. And, you know, it's still ongoing, of course.
Yes.
So yeah, many different relationships with Gaga and its approach. Yeah, it's a great method to, especially if you already done some training, you know, it can really kind of put a virus inside it and, shake things up or infuse things with something new.
Yeah. Wow. So my last question would be, with all these years of your movement practice, your research, your quest in a way, do you find your inner child or the vulnerable side of you to also come out, not just in your movement, but also as a human being in your normal life? Is it much easier to just tap that and just allow it to come, or is it something? Because I think it's very, very difficult for people, especially the moment we become adults. I think it's very hard to just let those come in. And how do you feel about that?
Yeah. Yeah, it depends, Sometimes we lose it because of the context we're coming into or growing up. I'm lucky that way because, where I live, the environment I live in. So for me, it's fairly, it's available. But also sometimes that child you speak about sometimes cannot come out because we live in a very serious world. If you do a lot of meditation, things become really silly. Things become. It's very hard to keep taking things seriously. But then you come back after a retreat, for example, to the real world, and people take things very seriously, even when they say, let's give ourselves the permission to laugh at ourselves. They will still do it very seriously. Things are already funny as they are. Giving yourself permission to laugh at yourself is very silly.
Yeah.
That implies that you're taking yourself very seriously, which in itself is already funny. So, but in order to function in a world like that, sometimes, you can't just. Sometimes you have to keep the inner child not locked away, but just keep him in the background sometimes. And I guess that's from a lot of people, according to where they work or they live. But I often have the both going on. Like, situations that are highly serious and tense, and to me they're hilarious, or But of course, that would be it's sometimes disrespectful to laugh at things that other people take very seriously, and not helpful. So I try to keep a straight face.
Thank you for listening to the podcast When We Move. Stay updated for more interesting conversations coming up with a different guest every Friday. To watch or hear previous episodes, click on the link given in the description. Stay safe and keep moving.